She arrived at the venue earlier than most people expected. The building was not large, but it had a quiet charm that made it feel more important than it looked from the outside. Soft lights glowed through tall windows, and inside, chairs were being arranged in neat rows. People moved around with last-minute preparations, speaking in low voices as they checked sound equipment and adjusted decorations. She stood near the entrance for a moment, holding a small bag with a few personal items and sheet music she had brought just in case. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. She did not try to stand out. In fact, if someone glanced at her quickly, they might assume she was part of the staff or simply a guest attending the event. That was something she had experienced many times before, and she had learned not to take it personally. The invitation she had received for this event was simple. They needed a pianist to provide background music for an evening gathering. Nothing too serious, nothing too formal, just something soft to fill the silence between conversations. It was the kind of request she had accepted many times in the past, so she agreed without hesitation. It was work, and she respected every opportunity she received, no matter how small it seemed. As she walked inside, she noticed the atmosphere was slightly tense. The organizers were clearly busy, trying to make everything perfect. One of them approached her briefly, glancing at her with a polite but slightly distracted expression. There was a quick greeting, followed by a short explanation about where she would be seated. Then came the unexpected words spoken casually, almost as an afterthought. She was told that tonight, something simple would be enough. Just simple music. Nothing complicated. She nodded quietly, as if she had expected this. There was no protest, no question. She had learned long ago that people often made assumptions before hearing a single note. To them, simplicity meant safety. It meant background noise that would not interrupt their evening. But to her, simplicity was something different. It was the beginning of everything. She followed the instructions and made her way toward the piano placed at the side of the hall. It was a beautiful instrument, polished carefully, reflecting the warm lights above it. A few guests were already seated, chatting softly or checking their phones. No one seemed particularly focused on the piano yet. It was just another part of the room, waiting to be used when needed. She placed her bag beside the bench and sat down slowly. For a moment, she simply looked at the keys. There was always a small pause before she began playing, a moment where everything around her seemed to fade slightly. It was not nervousness. It was more like entering a space where only sound would matter. From a distance, she could hear faint laughter and the clinking of glasses. The event had not fully started yet, and people were still settling in. A few eyes glanced in her direction but quickly moved away. No one expected anything special. That was clear. To them, she was just the person assigned to play soft music in the background. She gently placed her fingers on the keys without pressing them. Her hands were steady, calm, and familiar with this moment. She had done this many times before in different places, for different crowds, but every time felt slightly different. Every room had its own energy, even if people did not notice it. The organizer gave a small signal from across the room. It was time to begin. She took a slow breath and pressed the first note. It was soft, almost fragile, the kind of sound that did not demand attention. It blended into the room quietly, like a gentle wave touching the shore. A few people nearby continued their conversations without reacting. Others barely noticed anything had started. She continued playing slowly, carefully choosing each note. The melody she chose was simple, almost childlike in its structure. It was exactly what had been requested. Nothing more, nothing less. It floated through the room like a light breeze, easy to ignore if someone chose to. For the first minute, nothing changed in the room. People remained engaged in their own conversations. A waiter passed by carrying drinks. Someone laughed at a joke near the back. The music was there, but it had not yet become part of the moment. But she did not rush. She never rushed. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, as if she was telling a story only she fully understood. Each note had intention behind it, even if no one was paying attention yet. She knew that sometimes music did not reveal itself immediately. It needed patience. As she continued, something subtle began to shift in her playing. The simple melody did not stop, but it started to breathe differently. There was a slight change in rhythm, almost unnoticeable at first. A soft variation here, a gentle pause there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would force attention. It was more like planting small seeds within the sound. A few guests started to slow their conversations without realizing why. One or two people glanced toward the piano, then looked away again. The music was still simple, still soft, but something about it was beginning to feel different. She kept her gaze on the keys. Her expression remained calm, almost unreadable. She was not performing for attention. She was simply letting the music unfold as it wanted to. The room had not yet realized it, but the atmosphere was slowly starting to respond to her. The melody shifted again, slightly deeper this time. The same theme was still there, but it carried more emotion now. It was no longer just background sound. It was beginning to feel like something with direction, something with meaning. At the edges of the room, people started to notice. Not everyone, just a few. A man paused mid-conversation, as if he had forgotten what he was going to say. A woman turned her head slightly toward the piano, her expression uncertain. The sound was still gentle, but it was no longer invisible. She continued playing, unaware or perhaps uninterested in the growing attention. Her world had narrowed to the piano and the flow of sound beneath her fingers. The simplicity she had started with was still there, but now it carried something deeper underneath it, something that could not be easily explained. The room, once noisy and casual, was beginning to shift into quiet observation. Not complete silence yet, but a gradual reduction in distractions. People were starting to listen without even realizing they had made that choice. And she had not even begun to show what she was truly capable of yet. She kept playing with the same calm presence, but something inside her had already started to shift. Not in a rushed or dramatic way, but in a quiet understanding that the room was beginning to change its attention. She could feel it without looking up. The way people paused slightly between conversations. The way a few voices grew softer. The way chairs adjusted as people turned just a little toward the piano. Still, she did not react. She had learned not to chase attention. Attention was never something she needed at the beginning. It always came later or not at all. What mattered most to her was the sound, the feeling inside the music, and the honesty of each note she placed into the air. The simple melody continued, but now it was no longer just a background sound. It had started to form a shape in the room, like something slowly waking up. The audience did not fully understand it yet. They only sensed something different, something they could not easily ignore anymore. Near the side of the room, one of the organizers watched carefully. At first, there had been little concern. The instruction had been clear. Simple music only. Something soft, something safe. That was what had been expected. But now, the atmosphere was not staying as predictable as planned. The organizer shifted slightly, glancing between the performer and the guests. The music was still gentle, but it no longer felt like simple background sound. There was a depth forming inside it. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly powerful in a way that was difficult to describe. Still, no one interrupted. The performance was allowed to continue, and she kept playing. Her fingers moved with steady confidence. Each motion was smooth, almost natural, as if the piano keys were not being pressed but gently guided into sound. The melody she had chosen remained simple on the surface, but underneath, there was structure building, like layers slowly being added without anyone noticing the exact moment it began. A few guests who had been talking earlier now found themselves speaking less. Some stopped completely without realizing it. It was not a forced silence. It was more like the room was adjusting itself, as if the music was gently asking for attention instead of demanding it. She remained seated in the same posture, calm and focused. Her expression did not change. There was no sign of effort or struggle. To anyone watching closely, it might have looked almost effortless. But what they could not see was the careful control behind every note. The way she guided the flow without breaking the simplicity that had been requested. A small memory crossed her mind, not in a distracting way, but like a quiet reminder. She had been in similar situations before. Places where she was underestimated. Places where people expected very little and asked for even less. It was never spoken directly, but it could be felt in the tone of voice, in the way instructions were given, in the way expectations were lowered before she even began. She never argued with it. She never needed to. Music always answered better than words. The melody changed slightly again. Still the same foundation, but now it carried a soft emotional lift. It was subtle enough that many people in the room would not have been able to explain what was happening. But they could feel it. A gentle pull in their attention. A quiet curiosity forming. A few heads turned more directly toward the piano now. Conversations stopped completely in certain corners of the room. The sound of glassware and background movement became less noticeable. The music was slowly taking up more space in the atmosphere, not by force, but by presence. The organizer noticed it too. There was a brief moment of hesitation. This was not what had been expected. The original request had been something light and simple, something that would not distract guests. But now the opposite was happening. People were starting to pay attention in a way that could not be easily reversed. Still, there was something about the performance that made it difficult to stop. It was not loud or disruptive. It was controlled, graceful, and strangely calming even as it grew in depth. So the organizer said nothing and allowed it to continue, though with growing uncertainty. She, however, remained completely focused. Her world had narrowed further. The room around her felt distant now. Not because she was ignoring it, but because she was fully inside the music. Each note felt connected to the next, forming a path that she followed without hesitation. The simple tune she began with was still there, but now it was evolving in layers. Small variations became more noticeable. A change in rhythm here, a deeper note there, a soft pause that made the next sound feel more meaningful. It was like watching a plain sketch slowly turn into something detailed without losing its original shape. People in the audience began to react in small ways. One person leaned forward slightly. Another tilted their head as if trying to understand what they were hearing more clearly. A few stopped looking at their phones altogether. The room, once filled with scattered attention, was now slowly gathering into one shared focus. Still, she did not look up. There was no need to confirm what she already felt through the music. She trusted the process. She trusted the flow of sound as it moved through the room. And most importantly, she trusted that simplicity was not weakness. Simplicity could carry depth if handled with care. The melody softened again for a brief moment, almost like a breath. It created a pause in the emotional build, giving the audience a moment to settle. Some people relaxed without realizing they had been holding attention more intensely than before. It was a natural pause, but also a quiet preparation for what was coming next. The organizer glanced around the room again. The change was undeniable now. What had started as background music had turned into something that held attention without asking for it. The atmosphere was no longer casual. It was focused, curious, slightly amazed, even if no one had spoken those words yet. Still, there was no applause, no reaction loud enough to break the moment. It was as if everyone understood, even without communication, that interrupting would ruin something that was still unfolding. She continued playing. Her hands moved with a balance of control and feeling. There was no rush, no hesitation, just steady movement, as if she was walking carefully through a story only she could fully see. The piano responded to her touch like it was part of her thought process rather than an instrument. The melody began to open slightly more now. Not fully transformed yet, but clearly moving beyond its original simplicity. Carried more emotion, more structure, more weight. The audience could sense it even if they could not explain it. And slowly, the room that once treated her as background presence began to see her differently. Not fully yet, not completely, but enough to realize that what they were hearing was far beyond what they had expected when they said something simple. The room had now entered a different kind of silence. It was not the empty silence of nothing happening, but a silence filled with attention. People were no longer casually sitting or passing time. They were listening even if they did not fully understand why. Conversations had stopped completely in most areas, and even those who tried to continue speaking found it difficult to focus on anything other than the sound coming from the piano. She remained completely steady at the instrument. Her posture did not change, and her expression stayed calm. There was no sign of surprise or excitement in her face, even though the atmosphere around her had clearly shifted. To her, this was not about control over others. It was about allowing the music to grow naturally, without forcing it or holding it back. The melody she started with was still present, but it had now evolved in ways that were becoming more noticeable. It was no longer just soft background music. It carried direction, emotion, and a sense of movement that guided the listener without them realizing it. Each note felt connected, as if it belonged to something larger that was slowly being revealed. A few guests leaned slightly forward in their seats without thinking about it. Others tilted their heads, trying to understand what exactly had changed. The music was still simple in structure, but it no longer felt simple in experience. It had depth now, layers that were slowly unfolding like pages in a book being turned one by one. She continued without pause. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, never rushing, never forcing anything. There was a sense of patience in the way she played, as if she knew the exact right moment for every change in tone. The piano responded smoothly, each key pressed becoming part of a growing emotional flow that filled the room more with every passing second. At the edge of the hall, the organizers stood still, watching closely. The expression on their face had changed from casual oversight to focused attention. This was not what had been expected when the evening was planned. The instruction had been simple from the beginning. Something light, something easy, something that would not distract people from conversation. But now there was no conversation left to distract from. The organizer looked around again, noticing how fully the audience had been pulled into the performance. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were now completely silent. There was no disruption, no confusion, just a shared attention that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Still, no one interrupted. Something about the performance made it feel wrong to stop it. It was not loud or overwhelming. It was controlled and calm, yet it carried a kind of emotional pull that kept people from looking away. She, however, remained unaware of their reactions in a direct sense. Or perhaps she simply did not allow herself to be influenced by them. Her focus stayed inside the music. Each movement of her hand was guided by feeling rather than thought. The sound was no longer something she was creating step by step. It felt more like something she was discovering as it unfolded. The melody shifted again, becoming slightly more complex. Not in a way that broke the original simplicity, but in a way that expanded it. Like a small path turning into a wider road. The original tune could still be recognized, but now it carried variations that added emotional weight. Some parts felt softer, almost delicate, while others carried a deeper resonance that lingered slightly longer in the air. The audience began to respond in subtle ways. A few people stopped shifting in their seats altogether. Others held their breath for a moment without realizing it. One person placed their hands together in their lap, sitting still as if movement might break the atmosphere. There was a growing sense that something important was happening, even if it was not yet fully clear what that something was. The sound in the room felt different now. Even the smallest noises seemed less noticeable. The faint clinking of glassware had nearly disappeared. Footsteps from outside the room were no longer distracting. The piano had become the center of attention without any effort to demand it. She continued playing, her face calm and steady. There was a quiet strength in her focus. It was not the kind of strength that showed itself through intensity or visible effort. It was the kind that came from complete understanding of what she was doing. Every note she played had purpose, even when it sounded simple. There was nothing random in her movement, nothing uncertain. The melody began to rise slightly in energy. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a tide slowly lifting without breaking the shore. The emotional tone in the room began to shift with it. People who had been relaxed now felt a subtle increase in attention. Those who had been distant were now fully engaged. It was becoming impossible to ignore. The organizer took a small step forward, then stopped again. There was hesitation now, not because of confusion, but because of uncertainty about how to respond. The performance had gone beyond expectations, but it had not gone out of control. It was still elegant, still soft in tone, yet far more powerful than originally intended. And stopping it now felt like breaking something that was still being carefully built. So they stayed silent. She continued. The piano keys moved under her fingers with increasing fluidity. The melody she was shaping now carried a sense of progression, as if it was moving toward something without revealing what that something was. The audience could feel the direction, even if they could not predict it. Somewhere in the room, a guest who had been initially uninterested now sat completely still, eyes fixed on the performer. Another person slowly placed their phone face down, no longer interested in anything outside the moment. The shift in attention was no longer small. It was spreading quietly across the entire room. Still, she did not look up. Her entire presence remained within the music. There was no need for recognition in her expression. The performance itself was enough. The piano carried everything she needed to express, and she trusted it completely. The melody softened again for a brief moment, as if preparing for a deeper change. It was a pause that felt natural, not forced. The kind of pause that made the next note feel even more meaningful. The room seemed to understand this instinctively. Even without communication, people adjusted their attention, waiting without realizing they were waiting. The atmosphere had now fully transformed. What began as a casual evening gathering had turned into a shared moment of focus. No one was speaking. No one was distracted. All attention was directed toward a single point, the piano at the side of the hall. She continued playing, calm and steady, unaware or perhaps unbothered by how deeply the room had changed. And just beyond this growing silence, something even more unexpected was beginning to form within her performance. The silence in the room had now become steady, almost heavy in a calm way. It was no longer the kind of silence that came by accident. It was a silence that people were holding together, as if everyone understood without speaking that any noise would break something important. Even small movements felt slower now. Even breathing felt more noticeable. She continued to play without any change in her calm expression. Her hands moved in a smooth rhythm, and her focus stayed completely on the piano. It was as if nothing outside the music existed anymore. Not the people, not the room, not even the original reason she had been called there. The melody was still based on the simple tune she started with, but now it was clearly not the same piece anymore. It had grown into something deeper. The structure had expanded in small, careful ways. Each note seemed to carry more meaning than before, as if the music was slowly learning how to speak in a stronger voice without losing its softness. A few guests exchanged brief glances, but even those glances were quiet. There was no need for words. Everyone could feel it. Something was happening that they did not expect when they first sat down. This was not just background music anymore. It was becoming an experience that held the room together. The organizer stood at the side, still watching. At first, there had been confusion about how quickly the atmosphere had changed. But now that confusion had turned into attention. The performance was not breaking any rules. It was not loud or disruptive. Yet it had completely changed the energy of the event. There was a moment when the organizer looked around the room again. No one was talking. No one was moving casually anymore. Every face was turned toward the piano in some way. It was not forced attention. It was natural, as if the music had gently pulled everyone into the same place at the same time. Still, nothing was said. The decision to let it continue remained. She, meanwhile, stayed fully in her own world. Her face showed no pressure, no concern, no awareness of expectation. Her fingers moved with control and patience. Every small shift in the melody felt intentional, like she was guiding something forward step by step without rushing it. The music now had a flow that felt more emotional. Not dramatic, not loud, but deeper in feeling. It carried a sense of quiet intensity, like something being expressed that could not be said in words. The simplicity from the beginning was still there, but it was now covered in layers of emotion that gave it more depth. A guest near the middle of the room leaned back slightly, then forward again, as if unsure how to settle. Another person slowly folded their hands together, staring at the piano without blinking for a moment. The reactions were small, but they showed how deeply the sound was reaching them. Even the air in the room seemed different now. It felt stiller, almost heavier, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of stillness that made people more aware of everything happening in the moment. She continued without pause. Her hands moved across the keys with a balance of softness and strength. The music was no longer just following a simple pattern. It was now expanding, shaping itself into something more expressive. The changes were gradual, but they were clearly there. A slight increase in pace, a deeper tone in certain notes, a gentle rise in emotional weight. The audience could feel that something was building. They could not say what exactly was coming, but there was a sense of direction in the music now. Like walking along a quiet path that slowly starts to climb without warning. A few people in the back of the room adjusted their posture again. One person who had been leaning casually now sat upright. Another turned fully toward the piano, no longer pretending to be only half interested. The shift in attention had become complete. There was no more background noise of distraction. Everything was centered on her performance. The organizer noticed this too. There was a quiet realization that the evening had changed in a way that could not be reversed. What was supposed to be simple music in the background had become the main focus of the entire event. But still, there was no interruption. She continued playing, calm and steady. Inside her, there was no urgency. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply following the music as it unfolded. Each note felt like part of a conversation between emotion and silence. She did not force the direction. She allowed it to grow naturally, trusting the flow she had built from the beginning. The melody shifted again. This time, the change was more noticeable. The rhythm became slightly more structured, and the emotional tone deepened further. It still remained gentle, but there was now a stronger presence in the sound. It was no longer just something pleasant to hear. It was something that held meaning. The audience responded again in subtle ways. A few people lowered their gaze slightly, as if reflecting on something personal. Others remained fixed on the piano without moving. There was a shared feeling growing in the room, even though no one had spoken about it. It was not excitement. It was not confusion. It was something quieter, something more reflective. She played through it all with the same calm focus. The piano sounded fuller now. The notes seemed to carry more space between them, allowing each sound to breathe before the next one arrived. That space made the music feel more emotional, more thoughtful. It was as if the silence between notes was just as important as the notes themselves. The organizer glanced again at the room. The transformation was undeniable. What had started as a request for simple background music had turned into something that held every person's attention completely. There was no distraction left. No casual conversation. Only listening. Still, the performance remained controlled. It was not overwhelming. It did not demand reaction. It simply existed in a way that made it impossible to ignore. She continued. The melody now carried a sense of rising emotion, still gentle but clearly building toward something. It was like watching a calm surface of water begin to show movement underneath. Nothing chaotic, just a deeper energy forming slowly. The audience could sense it too. A quiet expectation had begun to grow. People did not know what was coming next, but they could feel that the music was leading somewhere important. And she, completely focused, kept guiding it forward without ever breaking the simplicity that had started it all. The room had now settled into a deep kind of attention, the kind that does not fade easily. No one was speaking, and even the smallest movements had slowed down. It felt as if the entire place had quietly agreed to stay still for as long as the music continued. The earlier casual energy was completely gone, replaced by something more focused, almost reflective. She remained at the piano with the same calm expression. There was no sign of pressure on her face, no change in posture, no hesitation in her movements. Her fingers continued to move across the keys with steady control, as if she was simply following something already written in her mind. Every note felt placed with care, even when it sounded effortless. The melody had now reached a point where it was no longer simple in any visible way. The original tune still existed, but it had become the foundation for something much larger. It was like a small stream that had grown into a wider river, still recognizable, but now carrying more depth, more movement, more emotional weight. People in the audience were fully engaged now. Some leaned slightly forward without realizing it. Others sat very still, their attention locked on the piano. A few had their hands resting quietly in their laps, as if even small gestures might disturb the moment. The music had created a shared silence that felt natural, not forced. The organizer stood near the side, no longer checking notes or instructions. All earlier concerns about keeping it simple had faded into the background. What was happening now was clearly beyond those expectations. There was no need to guide or adjust anything anymore. The only choice left was to let it continue. The performance had become something that could not be interrupted without breaking the mood of the entire room. She continued playing without looking up. Her focus remained entirely within the sound. Each movement of her hands was smooth and controlled. There was a sense of patience in the way she shaped the music, as if she understood that the most powerful moments do not come quickly. They build slowly, layer by layer, until they reach a point where everyone can feel them at the same time. The melody shifted again, and this time the change was clearer. The rhythm became slightly more expressive, not faster, but more defined. The notes carried a stronger emotional pull, as if they were speaking in a language that did not need translation. The room responded instantly, even though no one consciously decided to react. A few guests adjusted their posture again, sitting more upright. Others tilted their heads slightly, as if trying to understand the direction the music was taking. The feeling in the room was no longer passive listening. It had become active attention. Everyone was now following the same flow. Still, she did not change her expression. To her, this was not about gaining attention. It was about allowing the music to reach its natural form. She continued to guide the melody with quiet confidence, never forcing it, never rushing it. The piano responded like an extension of her thoughts, each note flowing into the next without interruption. The atmosphere in the room had become almost weightless in a strange way. Not empty, but full of presence. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, where even the smallest sound carries meaning. The audience had completely stopped treating this as background entertainment. It had become something they were experiencing together. The melody reached another turning point. A subtle rise in emotion spread through the sound. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was noticeable. The music felt like it was moving closer to something important. There was a sense of direction now, a quiet build that made people feel like they were waiting for something without knowing what it was. Somewhere in the middle of the room, a guest slowly lowered their gaze, almost lost in thought. Another person gently exhaled and stayed still, as if afraid to break the moment. These were small reactions, but together they showed how deeply the music had entered the room. The organizer noticed this too. The entire audience was now fully absorbed. There was no distraction left. Even people who had originally been only mildly interested were now completely focused. The shift had happened gradually, but it was now complete. Still, there was no interruption. She continued playing, calm and steady. Her hands moved with increasing fluidity, as if the music itself was carrying them forward. The melody now felt richer, with more emotional layers forming beneath the surface. The simplicity from the beginning had not disappeared, but it had evolved into something more meaningful. The notes carried a sense of memory, reflection, and quiet emotion. It was not something loud or dramatic. It was something deeper, something that made people think without giving them clear answers. The audience felt it, even if they could not explain it. A few people blinked slowly, still focused on the piano. Others remained completely still, as if movement would break their connection to the moment. The shared silence in the room had become stronger than any sound outside it. She continued without pause. There was a natural flow in her playing now, like she had entered a space where everything aligned perfectly. The piano no longer felt like an instrument she was controlling. It felt like something she was moving through, as if the music already existed and she was simply revealing it step by step. The melody began to rise gently once more. Not suddenly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a smooth progression that felt inevitable. The emotional weight increased slightly, and the room responded again. People straightened a little, focusing more deeply. The sense of anticipation had grown stronger. Something was clearly building. Even though no one could predict it, everyone could feel that the music was leading somewhere. There was a shared understanding in the room that something important was approaching, even if it had not yet arrived. The organizer remained still, watching carefully. There was a quiet realization that this performance had gone far beyond what had been planned. It was no longer about background music or simple expectations. It had become the central moment of the entire gathering. And yet, it still felt controlled. It still felt gentle. That was what made it so powerful. She continued playing, fully absorbed in the flow of sound. The melody now carried a sense of depth that seemed to hold the entire room together. Every note mattered. Every pause mattered. The audience was no longer just listening. They were experiencing something that was unfolding in real time. And just as the emotional build seemed to reach its peak, there was a quiet shift in the air, as if the music itself was preparing to reveal something no one in the room was ready for. The room had reached a point where even silence felt different. It was no longer just the absence of sound. It felt like something active, something alive, something shared between every person present. No one moved without thinking. No one spoke. Even small adjustments in seating had stopped. It was as if the entire room had agreed, without words, to stay connected to the moment unfolding at the piano. She continued playing with the same calm focus, but there was something different now in the way the music flowed. It was no longer just building slowly. It felt like it had reached a deeper level, where every note carried weight and meaning. The melody, which began as something simple and almost casual, had now become a full emotional journey. Her hands moved with steady control, but also with a natural softness, as if she was no longer thinking about each note individually. The music seemed to guide her as much as she guided it. The piano responded in a fuller voice now, each sound filling the room more completely than before. The audience could feel it clearly. Something important was happening. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet and powerful way that held everyone's attention without effort. People were no longer just listening. They were feeling it. A few guests had their eyes fixed on the pianist without blinking. Others sat very still, as if afraid that even a small movement might break the atmosphere. The energy in the room had changed completely from the beginning of the evening. What was once casual and relaxed had now become deeply focused and emotional. The organizer stood at the side, no longer checking anything or giving instructions. There was nothing left to adjust. The performance had taken full control of the room in a way that could not be planned or managed. All that remained was watching and allowing it to unfold. She, however, stayed fully inside her own world. Her expression remained calm, her posture unchanged. There was no visible effort in her performance, even though the music had clearly grown in complexity and emotional depth. It felt like she was simply opening a door to something that already existed rather than creating it from nothing. The melody began to rise once more. This time, the shift was stronger, more noticeable. It was still smooth and controlled, but there was a clear emotional lift in the sound. The music carried a feeling of reflection, almost like a story reaching a meaningful point. The original simple tune was still there, but it had transformed so much that it felt like a distant memory of where everything began. The audience reacted without speaking. A few people leaned slightly forward again. One person pressed their hands together gently. Another lowered their gaze for a moment, as if processing something personal that the music had quietly brought to the surface. These reactions were small, but they showed how deeply the performance had reached them. No one was distracted anymore. Not a single person in the room was looking away. She continued playing, steady and calm. Her fingers moved across the keys with increasing fluidity, and the music now had a sense of direction that felt almost inevitable. It was not rushing. It was not forced. It was simply moving forward, step by step, toward something that everyone could sense but no one could define. The room itself felt different now. The air felt still but not empty. It was filled with attention, emotion, and shared focus. Even the lighting seemed softer somehow, as if the entire space had adjusted itself to match the mood created by the music. The melody reached another gentle rise. It was not a sudden peak, but a steady increase in emotional depth. The sound grew fuller, warmer, and more expressive. Each note seemed to carry something unspoken, something that could not be easily described but was clearly felt. The audience stayed completely silent. There was no discomfort in that silence. Instead, it felt natural, almost necessary. No one wanted to break it. No one even thought about it. The music had created a space where silence felt like part of the performance itself. She continued without hesitation. Her focus was absolute but still calm. There was no visible strain, no sign of effort. It was as if she was simply following a path that was already clear to her, moving through the music with quiet confidence. Every change in tone felt intentional but effortless. The piano now sounded richer than before. The notes carried more depth, and the pauses between them felt more meaningful. It was not just about what was being played, but also about what was being left unsaid. That balance made the performance feel even more powerful. The audience felt it deeply. Some people closed their eyes for a brief moment, not to sleep or disconnect, but to feel the music more clearly. Others kept their eyes open, completely focused on the pianist, as if trying to hold on to every detail of what was happening. There was a shared understanding growing in the room. This was not an ordinary performance. It was something that would be remembered. The organizer noticed this too. There was a quiet realization that the evening had become something far beyond what had been planned. What was meant to be simple background music had turned into the central experience of the entire gathering. Yet it never broke its calm tone. It never became loud or overwhelming. That was what made it so remarkable. Still, no one interrupted. She continued playing. The melody now felt like it was approaching its final stage. There was a sense of completion forming within it, a gentle movement toward closure. The emotional weight was stronger now but still controlled. It was like watching a story reach its final meaning without needing words. The audience could sense it too. There was a quiet anticipation in the room. Not excitement but awareness. Everyone understood that something was coming, something that would bring this entire journey to a close. She guided the final movements of the melody with the same calm presence. Each note felt carefully placed, each pause meaningful. The sound filled the room fully, then began to soften gradually, as if preparing to release its hold. And then, slowly, the music began to settle. The final notes were gentle, soft, controlled. They did not end abruptly. Instead, they faded naturally, like a quiet breath leaving the room. The last sound lingered just long enough to be felt, then slowly disappeared into silence. The room did not react immediately. For a moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just stillness. It was not an empty silence. It was a full silence, heavy with emotion and attention. No one seemed ready to break it. She kept her hands still on the keys for a brief moment, then gently lifted them away. Her expression remained calm, unchanged, as if she had simply completed something exactly as it was meant to be. And then, the silence remained a little longer, holding the entire room in place, as if no one wanted to be the first to let it go.